Jon Snow had never considered that he would one day wear a crown. He was a man of the north, shaped by winter winds and duty. Through trial and tragedy, he had found out the truth of his birth, standing on a narrow edge between honor and heritage. Yet despite it all, he had tried to see himself only as Jon Snow, a man who served, a man who guarded. Fate, it seemed, did not care much for his preferences. Fate found him. Fate set him on a course that was both wondrous and terrifying, shaped by dragons, wars, betrayals, and the relentless churn of hope. But in the days after the defeat of the Night King and the restoration of some semblance of peace, he found that the world expected him to claim that which he had never wanted, power over the Seven Kingdoms. He had turned away at first. He was too much the product of Ned Stark's gentle sense of honor, too used to the chill of duty, to the necessity of sacrifice. But then there was Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen, fierce and driven, whose own life had been a series of trials that shaped her fire. They had been adversaries, allies, lovers in secret, and at last, in the aftermath of endless battles, they had become something stronger than all that. He had knelt before her once, and now she knelt before him as well, each pledging to walk this new path together. Their marriage was no grand, gilded ceremony in the heart of King's Landing. It was held first under the open sky in the north, just outside Winterfell's gates, because winter had only recently passed and the memory of the long nights still lingered in the crispness of the air. The Northmen were uneasy at first about bending the knee to a Targaryen queen, especially one they had only just met. She was the mother of dragons, a woman of fire, and the North had always hewed more to the chill of ice. But Jon's faith in Daenerys spoke volumes, and Sansa's cautious but necessary support turned hearts from suspicion to reluctant acceptance. Daenerys, for her part, arrived at the short ceremony not in a gown that boasted her house colors but in a simple white cloak that had once belonged to her departed handmaiden, carefully mended to bear the sigil of the dire wolf and the dragon entwined. She did not need to flaunt power anymore. Her dragons circled overhead, shadows in the sky that promised her strength. They stood together, hand in hand, as the snow melted and the ground thawed around them. Bran, seated in his wheeled chair to witness the union, observed with ancient eyes. Arya remained on the periphery, watchful and quiet as she always was, her presence like the glint of a hidden blade. Tyrion Lannister stood by Daenerys, ready to speak words of counsel if needed, but there was no place for a hand to interrupt such a simple vow. Though there was much cause for pomp and formality, the ceremony was short, officiated by none other than Samwell Tarly, who, after seeing the worst in the dark, embraced the quiet and warmth of a new beginning. Jon and Daenerys bound themselves in words older than any library record. An oath of family and trust, words that breathed the promise of union between North and South, Stark and Targaryen. Their people stood in a hushed circle around them, a gathering of lords and ladies whose breath caught invisible clouds in the chill air. Then Jon lifted Daenerys' hand and kissed it as a hush fell, a gentle vow of what would come next. That night, they feasted in Winterfell's great hall. The ghosts of the past lingered in every corner, but the blazing hearths and the laughter of the gathered served as a testament to hope. The feast was not extravagant. Supplies had been consumed in the war against the dead, and the North had always valued practicality over luxury. Yet the atmosphere was joyous, with shared memories of victory over the White Walkers and illusions of a brighter future. Outside, droves of survivors huddled around makeshift fires, the men of the North rubbing elbows with the unsullied, Dothraki, and soldiers from the various houses that had sworn to Targaryen rule. Language and custom might have been a barrier, but a new peace loosened tongues and hearts. Mead and ale, laughter and stories crossed cultural lines. The dragons soared overhead, occasionally blotting out the moon and eliciting cheers of awe from even the most stoic northern farmer. Far from the opulence of the Red Keep, the people began to sense that perhaps a new era might be possible. One that did not revolve solely around fear of tyranny or winter's horrors. Within the hall, Daenerys sat at the head table beside Jon, her face alight with unguarded happiness. Even the small lines of weariness that war had etched into her features softened. She looked upon the North with acceptance, wearing a plain silver circlet in her hair, reminiscent of the crowning that should have happened in King's Landing. Jon sat at her side, half in disbelief, half brimming with cautious anticipation. His hair was pulled back in a loose knot. His fine Stark leathers repaired so many times the original stitching was scarce, but they reminded him of who he was. Between them, a single cup shared wine. They leaned close now and then, speaking quietly amidst the clamor of celebration, forging a new bond in a swirl of toasts and piping hot stews. In the days that followed, Daenerys stayed in the north at Winterfell, longer than anyone might have expected. She explored the ancient corridors, conversed with the Stark bannermen, visited the crypts. She touched the statue of Lyanna Stark, the Aunt Jon had scarcely known but whose memory hung heavy in the air. Daenerys whispered softly to the cold stone, words so hushed only Jon heard them. "We must make amends for old wrongs." She promised that her rule, alongside Jon, would be different from the Targaryen rule of old. There was a gravity to her vow that echoed in the quiet gloom of the crypts. Jon's hand was on her shoulder, and in that single gesture, the centuries of blood feuds, rebellions, and heartbreak seemed to converge into a fragile unity. The North was not won over in a single day, nor a single week. Some older lords muttered behind closed doors that a Targaryen on the throne was a risk they should not take. The scars of the Mad King still traced their lineages, and they remembered the fields burnt by dragonfire. But Jon's presence tempered their hatred. He was the blood of Ned Stark, after all, raised as a son of Winterfell, loyal to a fault, and undeniably part of their world. Daenerys did not shy away from hearing their concerns. She held open forums in the courtyard, encouraging the people to speak. She listened, truly listened, to stories of burnt fields, of the fear that dragons brought. She told of her own hardships, how she had been sold as a bride, how she had freed slaves in Essos, how she had learned that people only followed her for love when she gave them a reason beyond fear. Over time, the ancient enmity softened. There came a moment, 3 weeks after their wedding, when a messenger from King's Landing arrived with urgent summons. King's Landing was, by tradition, the seat of the monarchy, and news of Daenerys and Jon's marriage had swept the realm in rumor and speculation. Some lords of the Crownlands were uncertain, some outraged that Daenerys had first gone north to marry in her new husband's homeland. Others insisted that the rightful place for a new royal couple was on the Iron Throne, crowned beneath the gaze of the Red Keep. But Jon and Daenerys exchanged a long look when the messenger arrived, saw the fear behind his eyes, and knew that while the people in the capital might be anxious, the capital itself was in disarray. So they made their journey south. The northern roads were still recovering from the brutality of winter's end, rutted with mud and deep puddles. Daenerys rode with Jon at the front, her face set in determined lines, a silver cloak draped around her shoulders. Ghost padded alongside them for a time, his white fur a stark contrast to the churned brown ground. With them rode the Unsullied, a handful of northern guards led by Ser Brienne of Tarth, and a small retinue of the Stark household men. More wagons followed, filled with meager supplies. Winter had not been kind. Looming overhead soared Regal and Drogon, the last living dragons. Occasionally, Drogon would shriek, shaking the air with a sound as ancient as magic itself. Even travelers who questioned the new monarchy looked up at that silhouette and felt something akin to reverence. It was not mere fear, it was awe. As they passed the Neck, the territory of House Reed, a group of crannogmen offered them passage through the bogs that had once proven treacherous to outsiders. Jon had never visited them before, but the small clan heads knew well the story of Mira and Jojen, and they welcomed him. They lit torches at dusk and guided the company through hidden pathways. Daenerys, exhausted but polite, thanked them in turn. The crannogmen bowed with genuine, if wary, respect, remarking that they had never seen a queen come so plainly through their lands, unafraid to meet them without grander trappings. At Moat Cailin, the travelers saw the old fortress in ruins, battered by centuries of conflict. Tyrion, riding with them, observed that it might be rebuilt as a proud seat of the North, a sign of unity with the South. Jon didn't contradict him. Yet part of him wondered if leaving Moat Cailin in its broken state might serve as a reminder of how easily power can crumble if left untended. Daenerys listened to both viewpoints, making no immediate declaration. Her leadership style had shifted in subtle ways since learning the depths of what war could cost, especially after the near-apocalyptic battle with the White Walkers. She no longer demanded immediate action. She contemplated, weighed counsel, and spoke with the measured confidence that comes from fighting the dead and emerging scarred but alive. South of the Neck, the atmosphere began to shift. The skies felt warmer. Green fields replaced the gray and white expanses of the north. The people along the roadsides eyed the royal procession with equal parts curiosity and concern. Rumors flew in the villages, the Dragon Queen and King in the north ride together. Some whispered that Jon was the true son of Rhaegar Targaryen, which would make him the rightful heir. Others said that the marriage was a ploy, that Daenerys still hungered for the Iron Throne in her own name. Yet the travelers from both Essos and Westeros in the group, armed but largely at ease, did not cut the profile of conquerors. Children ran after them laughing, wanting glimpses of the dragons overhead. Farmers tipped their hats or gave brief bows. The memory of the realm's rescue from the Night King was not easily forgotten. Near Harrenhal, they paused by the massive, blackened ruins. The largest castle in the realm, cursed by dragonfire centuries ago. Smoke from cooking fires rose in the distance. Refugees still occupied some of the ruined towers. Jon, Daenerys, and a small escort went inside to greet them, uncertain what they would find. Tyrion remained outside, carefully taking note of the broken ramparts. The local folk wore ragged clothes, their faces hollow from recent famine. The long night had left devastation everywhere, not just in the far north. Daenerys and Jon offered what little fresh bread and grain they carried with them in one of the wagons. The refugees bowed awkwardly, uncertain if they should kneel, uncertain if they should trust. A younger girl, no older than 10, asked Daenerys if her dragons might burn them again. The heartbreak on Daenerys's face at the question was so stark that she crouched down, took the girl's hand, and promised her that the only fire left would be that which warms and protects. The child did not entirely believe her, but she did not run away either. It was a small gesture, but it moved the watchers along the shattered walls. They continued south. Along the way, small lords rode to greet them, hoping to curry favor or simply catch a glimpse of the rumored new king and queen traveling side by side. Some tried to gauge whether the monarchy might dissolve into warring claims once again. But as they witnessed the gentle camaraderie between Jon and Daenerys, her occasional laugh at his dry northern humor, his quietly protective posture at her side, the unspoken trust in each other's presence, they began to realize that this was not the start of another Targaryen civil war. This was something else. Something perhaps the realm had not seen in a very long time, a marriage anchored by a genuine bond, forged by common trials, both personal and grand. When at last they neared King's Landing, the city's famous red walls came into view. Banners still hung from the towers, tattered from recent conflicts. The city had been partially ravaged by the arrival of the White Walkers at the capital's doorstep, an unthinkable notion months prior. Though the undead had not conquered the south as thoroughly as they did the north, their approach had been enough to upend the city's fragile stability after Cersei's fall. Within the gates, people milled in anxious clumps, uncertain whether to greet their new queen and king with cheers or silence. The Gold Cloaks had reformed under a new Lord Commander, a cautious man named Garth Meadows. He led a line of city watch who parted the crowd to make way for the royal party. Tyrion rode ahead, exchanging quick words with the watch to ensure a safe passage. Jon felt tension coil in his stomach as they passed through the streets. This was far from the north, far from his comfort. He saw the wreckage of certain neighborhoods, saw the meager rations in the hands of weary mothers and fathers. The cost of war was visible in every alley. Daenerys's gaze flickered from the hungry faces to the half-rebuilt spires in the distance. She recalled what had happened the last time a Targaryen king lost sight of the people's needs. She forced a calm, collected nod at those who bowed. She was determined to do better. They rode on, crossing the city's thoroughfares until they reached the Red Keep. Even that great fortress had not escaped the devastation of recent battles. Some ramparts were scorched, others partly dismantled. Up on a hill near the keep rose the tall, charred skeleton of the dragon it once used to house the Targaryen dragons centuries before. The gates creaked open, and inside stood a contingent of knights and lesser nobles. Awaiting them in the courtyard was Ser Davos Seaworth, whose loyalty to Jon was unwavering as the tide. Next to him stood Grey Worm, silent and watchful, the commander of the Unsullied who had never been entirely at ease with the politics of Westeros, but who followed Daenerys with unwavering devotion. Varys was gone now, lost in the final conflicts. No spider remained to spin webs of secrets. Instead, Tyrion had grown into the role of a more direct counselor, forging alliances with individuals who believed in their cause. Yet the realm was still rife with uncertainties. The lords and ladies who had gathered in the courtyard waited for some declaration, some symbol that the new monarchy had truly begun. Daenerys, dismounting, cast her gaze over the uncertain throng. She removed her gloves, approached Davos, and greeted him with genuine warmth. Jon followed, giving the older man a quick embrace. They exchanged updates, speaking in hushed tones about the uneasy calm in the city. The merchants on the street of Silk worried about trade routes. The fishmongers by the harbor complained about rotting catches due to inadequate markets. The Red Keep staff had mostly fled or had been replaced. The city was in a transitional state, a precarious balance between the end of one regime and the uncertain birth of another. Jon listened carefully to Davos's words and caught Daenerys's eye. This was the consequence of wearing crowns, the unglamorous truth of it. Not the sweeping pageantry of conquest, but the day-by-day grappling with real hardships. They moved inside, accompanied by the watchful eyes of the Unsullied and a delegation of northern guards. The throne room was still as grand as it had ever been, though the tall windows bore spiderweb cracks from the siege. Sunlight lanced in from above, illuminating the Iron Throne at the far side. That throne of swords, once rumored to be 1,000 blades hammered together, glistened with a dangerous beauty. Every small piece of twisted steel carried a story of war, submission, or fear. Daenerys paused at the foot of the throne, feeling the hush descend upon the group. She glanced at Jon, reading his discomfort. This seat had been the impetus for countless tragedies in their bloodline and beyond. Yet it was also the symbol of rightful rule in Westeros. A hush fell as Tyrion cleared his throat. In a solemn voice, he addressed the small gathering of lords and officials. "We come here in the name of peace," he began, "under the united banner of House Stark and House Targaryen, joined by the vow of marriage and tempered by the horrors we have all faced. May the realm flourish under this union." The gathered lords exchanged uneasy glances, some bowing, some waiting to see how the new rulers would present themselves. Daenerys turned from Tyrion's speech to face them directly. She lifted her chin, voice carrying with a gentler edge than the famed Targaryen fury. "The Seven Kingdoms have suffered too much loss," she said. "We have spilled each other's blood on fields of war, battled an undead threat that nearly extinguished all life, and witnessed lords and ladies tear this realm apart for personal gain. That must end. I stand before you, not as the conqueror my ancestors were, but as a queen who wishes to rebuild what has been broken and as a wife who stands beside her husband." All eyes swiveled to Jon. He took a slow breath. Public speaking had never been his gift, but he would not falter now. "I am no stranger to this realm's divisions," he began, voice quiet but firm. "I was raised a Stark. I have learned I am Targaryen by blood. I honor both. But above all, I stand for the living, for the people who must survive in the aftermath of all these wars. No king can do right by his people if he sets himself above them. Our vow is to serve, not to rule by fear." The hush became a murmured ripple. Ser Davos, in the back, gave a small nod of approval. Some eyes gleamed with hope, others with skepticism. The Iron Throne loomed, a silent challenge to anyone daring to claim it. For a moment, it looked as if Daenerys might ascend its steps and seat herself. But instead, she turned, glided back to Jon's side, and quietly asked the lords to rise from their bows. "Until a proper coronation, let us work together to mend the city," she said simply. That day marked the start of the new monarchy in practice, if not in official ceremony. Jon and Daenerys took up residence in the Red Keep, though they both often wandered outside its walls to see the state of King's Landing for themselves. They convened small councils daily: Tyrion, Davos, Grey Worm, Ser Brienne, and a scattering of lords from the Crownlands and the Riverlands who had come to assess the new leadership. They tackled everything from how to distribute grain shipments more fairly to how to employ the Dothraki who still roamed the outskirts. The coffers of the crown had been severely depleted by war, so raising funds for rebuilding projects became a pressing concern. Tyrion, clever as ever, suggested forging alliances with Bravos for credit, but Daenerys eyed him carefully and asked if that would chain them into debt to foreign bankers. Jon insisted that they must first see to feeding the starving in the city. They discussed, they argued, they compromised day after day. Yet despite the weight of these responsibilities, the union between Jon and Daenerys remained a bright thing. In the evenings, after hours of negotiations, they would return to their chambers, the door closing behind them, and for a short while, the burden of crowns fell away. Sometimes they spoke of trivial matters, how Ghost was adjusting to the warmer climate, or how Drogon found roost on the scorched remains of the Dragonet. Other times, they let the silence fill the space between them, content in the knowledge that, at last, they weren't alone. They were young, they were in love, and though it felt fragile, it was also powerful. The realm's hopes and doubts pressed upon them from all sides, but in those private moments, they found a measure of peace. Their marriage had not been arranged by politics alone, but by a necessity for unity shaped by the threat of extinction and a love that had blossomed unexpectedly. That reality lent them strength. Within a fortnight, official word spread throughout Westeros that the Targaryen Stark monarchy was in place, that the king in the north and the Dragon Queen were now as one. Envoys arrived from Dorne, a region which had long held a complicated relationship with the Iron Throne. The new Prince of Dorne, a distant cousin of the fallen Martell line, sent cautious words of cooperation but requested significant autonomy for his realm. Daenerys and Jon met with the Dornish envoy in a tower chamber overlooking Blackwater Bay. The conversation was tense but not antagonistic. The envoy spoke of Dorne's desire to remain free from what they saw as a pattern of northern oppression. Jon listened, recalling how the North, too, had once fought for independence. Daenerys, mindful of not igniting old resentments, patiently pointed out that unity in the face of the White Walkers had saved them all. In the end, they brokered a compromise. Dorne would swear fealty and remain part of the Seven Kingdoms under certain assurances of local governance. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a first step toward forging a peace that balanced old grudges with new realities. The Vale of Arryn, still under the regency of Lord Royce on behalf of the child Robin Arryn, sent a statement of allegiance, although it was peppered with conditions regarding trade privileges. Jon marveled at the labyrinth of treaties and demands, and Daenerys found herself missing the simplicity of liberating slaves in Essos, where the moral right had been much clearer. But together they persisted, refusing to resort to tyrannical decrees. Time and again they circled back to the promise they had made, to lead for the good of the realm, not for their personal glory. Meanwhile, the city's inhabitants began to see changes, if only small ones at first. The distribution of food became more equitable thanks to Daenerys' insistence on organizing the Unsullied to oversee fair lines at the granaries. The Dothraki, so often feared as marauders, were offered work patrolling the roads outside the city, and idea Tyrion proposed to incorporate their horsemanship and martial skills into something useful. At first, it prompted anxiety from local farmers, but soon, the roads around King's Landing grew safer from bandits. Little by little, the tension eased. Late one evening, after a grueling council session, Daenerys and Jon walked the ramparts of the Red Keep together, a soft summer breeze off Blackwater Bay ruffling Daenerys' silver-gold hair. The sky was dotted with stars. The city below was quieter now, with only the faint glow of torchlight marking the winding streets. Jon paused, resting his hands on the stone battlements. Daenerys stepped beside him, feeling the ache in her legs from hours of standing. The hush enveloped them, and for a moment they did not speak. Then Daenerys turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are we doing the right thing?" Her question echoed in the darkness. She was the woman who had once believed wholeheartedly in her destiny to sit on the Iron Throne by right, yet she had also felt the bitterness of betrayal, the heartbreak of losing so many who had supported her dreams. Now she walked a gentler path, more uncertain, free of the absolute certainty that had once burned in her. Jon let out a slow breath. "Sometimes," he began, "I think about those nights on the wall, standing watch, wondering if I'd ever have a real family. If I'd ever have a purpose beyond just fighting in someone else's war. Now here we are." She looked at him with a gentle smile. "I never wanted to just be someone else's queen. I wanted to be a queen who saved people. I suppose fate has a twisted sense of humor, bringing us here." Jon reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. They said nothing more for a time, and in that mutual silence, they found the answer. They were doing their best, despite the ghosts of the past and the burdens of the future. And for the first time in many years, the capital had a sense of fragile optimism. Below them, in the labyrinthine streets of King's Landing, a few commoners observed the faint figures atop the Red Keep. They whispered to one another about the Targaryen queen and the king in the north who had taken the city without burning it. They whispered of dragons overhead who had not unleashed fire upon their homes. They whispered of food lines that no longer ended in violence. And they whispered that perhaps a new day was dawning, perhaps the city and the realm might see a season of peace at last. Yet old scars ran deep. It would take more than a fortnight, more than a moon's turning, more than a single vow to mend all that had been torn apart. Even as hope flickered, uncertainties twisted in the shadows. Jon and Daenerys' nights alternated between tender closeness and anxious wakefulness. Sometimes one of them would rouse from half-remembered nightmares. Icy blue eyes staring at them from the darkness, or the roar of a dragon's flames echoing across a ruined city. They would reach for each other in the gloom, hands clasping, hearts racing, and find solace in the other's warmth. That was enough to push back the memories, at least for the moment. They had stood against the dead, they had faced each other's demons. If they could do that, perhaps they could guide the realm toward a lasting peace. Eventually, Daenerys decided it was time to formally claim the throne, not through conquest, but through a proper coronation in the sight of the lords and the faith of the Seven. The High Sparrow was gone, the faith militant in disarray, but a new High Septon had been chosen. He was a reserved, soft-spoken man of scholarly bent, more concerned with healing the realm than with meddling in politics. Jon was reluctant to kneel before any ceremony, especially one that felt foreign to his northern traditions. But they needed symbolism. They needed to show the Seven Kingdoms a unified monarchy if they wanted to quell the possibility of rebellion or further division. And so, with Sansa traveling down from Winterfell for the event, with Arya rumored to roam somewhere in the Riverlands, though no one quite knew where, with Bran sending his guarded blessing, they planned a ceremony that would be open to as many of the city's people as possible. There was no sense in shutting the doors of the Great September, except the Great September no longer stood, having been destroyed by wildfire in the time of Cersei's rule. Instead, they erected a temporary platform near the dragon pits, an outdoor space large enough to accommodate a crowd, though still a place of Targaryen memory. That day, a hush fell across King's Landing in the morning. The city's residents gathered to watch, curious and uncertain as a line of banners with interwoven dire wolf and dragon symbols fluttered in the wind. Daenerys wore a simple gown of black and red, embroidered with silver thread only at the edges. Jon wore dark leathers lacking any ostentatious crown. They stood side by side on the raised platform, the new High Septon just behind them. The Iron Throne was not there, no need to drag that monstrous seat of metal outdoors. Instead, a newly crafted pair of silver crowns waited on a velvet pillow, one for the King of the Seven Kingdoms, one for the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. They had chosen to be crowned together, symbolically rejecting the notion that one must overshadow the other. Sansa stood at the foot of the platform, watching with an air of wary pride. Her red hair gleamed in the sunlight, and her bearing spoke of a woman who had weathered every storm thrown at her. She had reservations about Targaryens, about the South, about trusting anyone outside the North, yet she believed in Jon, and perhaps she was coming to believe, at least a little, in Daenerys as well. Around her, the nobility of Westeros murmured, some wearing their own house colors, some in neutral attire. The people, in masses behind them, stood in hush, waiting to see this new chapter unfold. Jon took Daenerys' hand and they knelt together in front of the High Septon. The man spoke the traditional words of the faith, calling upon the seven aspects to bless this union of monarchy: the father for justice, the mother for compassion, the warrior for protection, the maiden for innocence, the smith for creation, the crone for wisdom, and the stranger for the unknown. Then he placed the crowns on their heads. Those crowns were not gaudy, not massive, but each bore delicate filigree in the shape of a dragon and a dire wolf, intertwined in subtle patterns. The High Septon proclaimed them king and queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the first men, lord and lady of the Seven Kingdoms, protectors of the realm. There was a moment of stillness, no roar of approval like in the days of old. This was a bruised realm, uncertain of itself. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause grew. It was not forced. It was not wholly exuberant, but it was real. Daenerys and Jon rose, stood on the platform, and looked upon their people. Dragons soared overhead, letting out distant cries that echoed over the city's hills. Behind them, the sun shone with a radiant defiance against the memory of war. Hope, precarious and new, flickered in every corner of King's Landing. That evening, small celebrations took root in the squares. Traveling musicians played lively tunes, children danced, and storytellers spun tales of how the king in the north brought dragons to the south and joined them with dire wolves in the ancient lines. Wine was shared, bread was broken, and for a night, the city exhaled. Within the Red Keep, a modest banquet was held. Lords and ladies mingled, exchanging gossip, eyeing the new monarchy with curiosity. The courtiers from distant corners of the realm tried to align themselves with this regime or that, all while the king and queen quietly observed. There were no illusions that unity had been won overnight. But it was a beginning. Jon Snow, once a bastard of Winterfell, and Daenerys Targaryen, once a beggar princess across the narrow sea, had come together in a marriage that stood not only for their personal bonds but for the fragile dream of peace that Westeros desperately needed. Much work remained. The scars of old wars and fresh betrayals would not vanish with a coronation. There would be attempts to test the monarchy to see if this new era could be toppled or exploited. Daenerys and Jon knew that. They felt it in the furtive whispers, the uneasy alliances, the flicker of ambition in certain courtiers' eyes. Still, for that one night, the realm rested in the possibility of better days. Ghosts roamed the corridors of the Red Keep, a silent sentinel. Drogon and Rhaegal circled overhead, watchful guardians. The fires in the city's hearths burned just a little brighter, as if stoked by hope instead of fear. In the privacy of their chambers, Daenerys removed her newly bestowed crown and set it on a small table. Jon did the same. They exchanged a look that held equal measures of relief and trepidation. Finally, Daenerys reached for his hand and he drew her close. There, away from the eyes of their people, away from the trappings of ceremony, they simply existed, two souls who had been forged in the crucible of war, daring to believe they could build something lasting from the ashes. And so the night passed in quiet closeness, each breath a reminder that they were still here, still alive, still bound together by love and by duty. Tomorrow, they would rise as king and queen, faced with the challenges of a realm that needed healing. But in that moment, in the candlelit hush of their chambers, they were simply Jon and Daenerys, entwined by destiny, forging a future with their own hands. And for them, for the first time in what felt like forever, that was enough. In the days that followed the coronation, a gentle warmth settled over King's Landing. Late summer breezes drifted through windows that had long been dark and cold, and the people felt a cautious stirring of hope. Jon and Daenerys found themselves caught in the whirl of royal duty. In the morning, they would wake to the chatter of servants in the corridors, the distant clang of soldiers training in the courtyard, the persistent hum of city life pressing in from beyond the walls. Both of them would dress simply, ignoring the advice of older counselors who urged them toward jeweled finery. Their crowns were displayed for official audiences, but neither felt comfortable wearing them every hour. The symbol was enough, they decided. What mattered was tending to the realm. Daenerys insisted on attending the morning distributions of bread, fish, and grain in the lower districts of the city. Her dragons were often seen overhead, flying lazy arcs above the rooftops, a reassuring yet formidable reminder that this monarchy was no mere figurehead. She would dismount at the edge of a winding street, accompanied by a small escort of Unsullied and a few city watchmen, and help the volunteers hand out rations. The first time she knelt to hand a loaf of bread to a child dusty-faced and too thin from recent famine, a hush fell on the crowd. They had never seen a queen do such a thing. The child's mother, eyes fearful, whispered a hurried thanks and bowed so low her forehead touched the ground. Daenerys gently touched her shoulder and told her to rise. Onlookers spoke of it afterward, the dragon queen who had knelt among them without a shred of condescension. Jon, for his part, found himself tethered to more administrative tasks than he had ever imagined. He had grown accustomed to the demands of leadership during the war against the dead, but that had been a different kind of urgency. Simple in its clarity, if brutal in its stakes. This was something else. 1,000 small crises, each demanding attention. A shortage of masons to repair the battered city walls. An influx of refugees from the war-torn countryside. A rumor of a new plague in the outlying villages. Debts left unpaid from earlier regimes. Every day, Tyrion brought him lists of problems that required solutions. And every day, Jon tried to juggle them with patience, calling on Davos's blunt wisdom, Brienne's steady sense of duty, and Grey Worm's quiet loyalty to Daenerys. Even so, the hours of reading reports and hearing petitions tested him more than any battlefield ever had. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, Jon would slip out to the training yard. He'd pick up a sword and join a sparring session with the Gold Cloaks or with Brienne. In that clatter of steel, he found a brief sense of normalcy. Sweat, exertion, the immediate need to defend and strike. Those were tangible challenges he understood. Afterward, he would feel calmer, more ready to face the endless swirl of governance. And inevitably, he would find Daenerys in some corner of the Red Keeper out in the city, both of them collapsing into the few moments of peace they could carve out together. It did not take long for the lords of the realm to sense that this new monarchy was unusual. Many traveled to King's Landing, uncertain whether to pledge themselves fully or to test the waters for advantage. Yara Greyjoy arrived from the Iron Islands, bearing the salt-stained banners of House Greyjoy. She had fought alongside Daenerys once, but the cost had been high. Her people had lost ships in the Great Wars, and the Iron Islands still reeled from the disruptions of Euron's madness. Yara entered the throne room in a swirl of brine-scented leather and sea-worn braids, her posture bold yet respectful. When Jon and Daenerys received her, Yara spoke plainly. The Iron Islands had never thrived under any distant crown, and the Greyjoys had always chafed at kneeling to the Iron Throne. But Yara was canny. She knew open rebellion now would only fracture what peace had been forged. She also knew the crown needed the Iron Islander ships to keep the coast secure and the trade lines open. So she offered a pledge of fealty on the condition that her people receive a measure of autonomy. Daenerys took note of the similarities between Yara's demand and what Dorne had sought. This realm was not the same 7 kingdoms that Aegon the Conqueror had united by sheer force. Lines had shifted. People remembered the taste of independence. Jon weighed Yara's request in silence before finally agreeing to grant her expanded local authority, so long as she upheld her oath to the throne and did not practice the old Ironborn habit of reaving the coasts. A handshake sealed the accord. It was a fragile thing, an agreement built on mutual need and a common desire to avoid war. But for now, it stood. Yara's satisfaction was measured, her eyes alert. She was a survivor. Still, she departed in good spirits, and word spread that the Greyjoys would work with, not against, the crown. Soon after, Gendry Baratheon came to court. He was newly legitimized, recognized as Robert Baratheon's son by royal decree after the war's end, an acknowledgement Daenerys and Jon had supported to stabilize the Stormlands. He arrived with a small retinue of knights bearing the stag sigil. The Stormlands had been devastated, caught first in the War of the Five Kings and later battered by the rumors of White Walkers and the subsequent forced marches through their lands. Gendry was no politician, he was a blacksmith at heart, straightforward and hot-blooded. He had accepted the lordship of Storm's End with some reluctance, guided by Davos's advice that the realm needed him. Now he stood before Jon and Daenerys in the Red Keep's hall, holding himself with more confidence than before but still lacking the polished veneer of a highborn. He asked for support in rebuilding Storm's End, new trade routes to bring in timber, and help from the crown to feed those who had fled to his domain in the wars. Jon respected the bluntness of his request. Daenerys admired the sincerity shining in his eyes, reminiscent of the honest loyalty she had once sought in her followers across the narrow sea. They granted him a portion of the crown's limited funds as well as permission to hire labor from the city with the condition that House Baratheon's resources would assist in repairing certain roads that connected King's Landing to the Stormlands. The arrangement, while modest, gave Gendry the means to begin restoring his ancestral seat and ensured that the crown might rely on him for defense in the southeast. After the audience, Gendry lingered a moment to speak with Davos, who clapped him on the shoulder, pride warming his gruff features. A new generation was coming to power, one shaped by war, tempered by necessity, but perhaps more open to forging alliances than their parents had been. Not everyone came forward with such cooperative intentions. A few discontented lords from the Reach, still smarting from the downfall of House Tyrell and the subsequent upheaval at Highgarden, arrived in King's Landing with carefully veiled opposition. They recognized Daenerys and Jon in name, but they carried themselves as if they sought to measure every word, searching for weaknesses in the monarchy. Their spokesperson was Lord Redwyne of the Arbor, who had once allied with the Tyrells. He stepped onto the dais where the Iron Throne glinted under torchlight and delivered a speech that trod the fine line between deference and grievance. He lamented the chaotic leadership transitions that had ripped the realm apart, questioned the crown's capacity to protect trade in the seas now that the Lannister fleet was all but gone, and pressed Daenerys about her dragons, implying that Highgarden's fields could be threatened if she ever chose fire over diplomacy. Daenerys could feel the tension rise in the hall. For a moment, the old Targaryen temper flickered inside her, the memory of how she had once demanded total obedience. But a glance at Jon, standing beside her, steadied her. She reminded herself of the pledge they had made to rule justly without the tyranny of the past. She answered Lord Redwyne with controlled calm, explaining how Yara Greyjoy's renewed alliance would ensure safer seas. She pointed out the efforts to restore trade routes from Dorne up through the Crownlands, which would eventually extend into the Reach. But she did not promise the kind of immediate prosperity that was impossible. Her words were measured. She made no threats about dragons. Instead, she spoke of forging a more equitable system of taxes that might fund the realm's restoration. Lord Redwyne seemed disappointed not to draw out her fury, but he could not deny her logic, and he ultimately bowed with stiff politeness. The exchange was not overly warm, but it was a demonstration that the monarchy intended to govern with a level head. Even those who would test them left with fewer reasons to turn outright hostile. There were also lords who simply did not know what to make of the new regime. Rumors about Jon's parentage had spread across Westeros. Whispers persisted that he was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, making him the truest heir. Some quietly questioned whether Daenerys and Jon might come into conflict over the line of succession. But as the weeks passed, it became clear the two of them worked in tandem, each deferring to the other in matters where they held greater knowledge. Jon was rarely overheard calling himself a Targaryen or a Stark. He was simply Jon, the king who had knelt beside his queen at their coronation, who gave no sign of trying to undermine her claim. Tyrion, watching from behind the scenes, remarked privately to Davos that the realm had never seen such an arrangement in living memory. The old Targaryens had always been absolute, and the Baratheons, Tullis, and Lannisters had fought wars rather than share. This union was something else entirely. Amid these shifts in power, Sansa Stark remained in King's Landing for several weeks. The Lady of Winterfell did not particularly like the city. She had too many dark memories of its treacherous courtyards and secret corridors. Yet she stayed to ensure the North's interests were well represented. She participated in councils, her sharp intellect cutting through the politicking of southern lords. More than once, she challenged Tyrion on certain financial matters, and while they disagreed, their interplay was surprisingly cordial. There was a mutual respect forged from all they had survived. At times, Sansa met privately with Jon and Daenerys, making sure that the North would not be overshadowed in the scramble to rebuild the southern heartland. Jon promised her that he would never forget the needs of their home. Daenerys pledged continued shipments of grain to help them recover from the long night's devastation. Though Sansa remained guarded, she could see they were earnest. She quietly admitted she was beginning to believe in Daenerys' sincerity. Arya Stark's location was a mystery even to Sansa, for a time. Some said they had glimpsed a small figure in leathers traveling the riverlands, or that a water dancer with a northern accent had been seen near the port of Maidenpool. Others claimed she was far to the west, near the Sunset Sea. Whether or not these stories were true, nobody knew. Jon only prayed that Arya was well, continuing her life of quiet wandering. He missed her presence, her fierce independence, and her unwavering loyalty. Yet a part of him knew Arya's spirit could never be caged in a court. She would find her own way, and if she ever chose to return, she would always have a place at their table. Bran Stark wrote from Winterfell, though his letters were often cryptic. He spoke of ravens across the realm, of visions of spring grass bursting through melting snow, and of the importance of remembering the mistakes of the past to avoid repeating them. Some wondered if the new king and queen should name Bran as an advisor in the capital, but Bran himself never expressed a desire to leave the north. He was the three-eyed raven, a being tied to the magic of the weirwood trees, far beyond the traditional spheres of lords and crowns. Nonetheless, his messages encouraged unity. Daenerys sometimes asked Jon if Bran's wisdom might help them see the future. Jon would only shrug, saying that Bran's knowledge was as vast as the old gods themselves. But it was not always straightforward. They would have to walk this path with their own feet. Now that the monarchy was settling into its reign, it was time to rebuild more than just walls and roads. People yearned for stability and for a glimpse of life beyond mere survival. To that end, Daenerys proposed a festival in the city to celebrate the beginning of a new royal line. A day of feasting, music, and games open to the common folk as much as to the lords. She wanted to show that their rule was not one of fear, that dragons need not always be instruments of war. Some in the small council resisted the idea, citing the cost. But Tyrion and Sansa both recognized the political value of forging goodwill among the masses. After all, it was the commoners who suffered the most when the realm fell into chaos. If they believed in the monarchy, they might be less inclined to follow any rebel calls to arms. Jon, who had never been one for revelry, hesitated. But seeing the spark of excitement in Daenerys' eyes and remembering how the North had once celebrated a victory feast at Winterfell, he agreed. Preparations for the festival began in earnest. The city's avenues were swept clean, broken cobblestones were repaired, at least in the main thoroughfares. Temporary stalls were built, offering fresh produce, salted fish, small crafts. A stage was erected near what remained of the dragon pit, where a group of traveling bards prepared to play. The festival was scheduled to last 2 days, culminating in a lavish feast at the Red Keep for those who could be accommodated, with smaller feasts funded by the crown scattered throughout the city's squares. Despite the realm's limited coffers, Daenerys insisted on releasing additional stores of grain and barley ale so that the poorest would have a chance to enjoy the festivities. It was a calculated risk. The monarchy was not drowning in wealth, but the gesture would inspire loyalty, and the city needed a breath of fresh air. The scars of war were still so visible. On the morning of the first festival day, the skies were clear, the sun bright. Musicians wandered the streets, playing lively tunes that drew curious children and tired mothers alike out of cramped dwellings. Vendors sold roasted nuts, sweetbreads, and small cups of spiced wine for a single copper. Bright ribbons and flags hung from windows, the combined sigils of the Stark dire wolf and the Targaryen dragon displayed in surprising harmony. Soldiers from the city watch wearing polished helms stood at crossroads to maintain order while the Unsullied patrolled the perimeter. The Dothraki, still somewhat feared by the city's inhabitants, nevertheless joined in with cautious curiosity. Some rode their horses in displays of skilled horsemanship, drawing cheers from crowds that had never seen such daring feats. Children laughed and clapped, and a palpable relief swept through the city. For 2 days, at least, it felt as though the grim memories of war receded. Daenerys and Jon walked among the people on that first day, forgoing the usual formality of mounted escorts. They moved slowly through the throngs, Daenerys smiling at those who greeted her, Jon offering polite nods and quiet words. Some knelt, but others simply bowed their heads, uncertain if this new monarchy truly wanted them prostrate on the ground. Daenerys waved for them to rise, and when the commoners realized they could speak to their queen without being harshly dismissed, small knots of conversation sprang up. Mothers asked about future harvests. Fathers wondered if there would be more stable work for them rebuilding roads. Jon listened, promising to relay their concerns to the council. Daenerys reassured them that once the lines of trade were fully operational again, more opportunities would arise. The talk was humble, practical, but it was also a far cry from the terror and secrecy of prior reigns. Even those who held private doubts had to admit that the realm felt different now. Midway through the festival, Tyrion orchestrated a mock joust, lance practice without sharpened tips. A handful of knights from the Crownlands participated, as did some from the Reach who had traveled with Lord Redwine. The crowds gathered near an impromptu tilt yard outside the city walls, cheering each contestant. Sansa watched from a wooden stand, her expression caught between amusement and the memory of an older, grander tournament so many years ago when she was a girl awed by kings and knights. Daenerys and Jon joined her, leaning against the rail. Jon could not help but compare these boisterous knights to the more somber realities of the wars they had all survived. Yet seeing the joy on the faces around him, the sense of normalcy in an event that once seemed impossible, he allowed himself a rare smile. Daenerys' eyes lit up when one knight dismounted dramatically and bowed to his queen, claiming to dedicate his victory to House Targaryen and House Stark. She acknowledged him with a laugh, the tension that so often haunted her face momentarily gone. When evening fell, torches and lanterns lit the squares. Music drifted from the corners of the city, blending with the sound of laughter. The Red Keep prepared to host a feast for visiting lords and the more prominent guildsmen, but Daenerys had commanded that the lesser feast in the outer courtyards be equally supplied with fresh food. She wanted no nobility-only banquet that reeked of exclusivity. Thus, 2 great feasting areas were arranged, one inside the keep, one in the open yard. The latter was more crowded, with merchants, soldiers, and small folk intermingling. Roasted boar, newly baked loaves, cauldrons of stew, barrels of ale, none of it was extravagant, but it was generous enough in these hard times. Jon and Daenerys made sure to appear in both feasting areas, dividing their time. In the courtyard, they moved through the throng, occasionally sampling a piece of hot bread from a vendor who urged them to taste the best in the city. In the grander hall, they listened to the bards who performed songs of peace and renewal. For that night, the gap between lords and commoners felt a bit less stark. Amid the revelry, subtle tensions bubbled under the surface. Ambitious minor lords sidled up to Tyrion, seeking to curry favor with the crown. A few whispered questions about the king's lineage, whether that meant the monarchy might shift again. Tyrion offered smooth, non-committal answers. Meanwhile, Sansa politely but firmly rebuffed any hint that the North was about to declare independence. She reminded them that the North still had its own customs and would always be protective of its autonomy, but it had recognized Jon as king and Daenerys as queen. Some courtly types found it strange that 2 rulers shared the throne yet seemed so in sync. In whispered corners, they speculated about what might happen if Daenerys bore an heir. Would that heir be Targaryen or Stark by name, or both? Would the child's claim supersede any older tradition? The monarchy itself was a living question mark, and the realm watched with bated breath. As the festival concluded, the city found itself reinvigorated. Merchants reported brisk trade, local theaters began staging new plays, and traveling minstrels from across Westeros showed up, hoping to capitalize on the increased coin flowing in the streets. It was not a golden age, too many had died, too many remained homeless, but it was a start. People who had forgotten how to smile rediscovered the smallest joys. Standing on a balcony overlooking the city, Daenerys and Jon shared a moment of quiet gratitude. She leaned her head against his shoulder, eyes drifting over the rooftops. He placed a hand at her waist. They said nothing. The hush between them spoke volumes about how far they had come. However, peace did not mean they could ignore distant troubles. The Iron Bank of Bravos, ever watchful, began sending envoys inquiring about old debts accrued by the Lannisters and by previous Targaryen rulers. Tyrion, well acquainted with the crown's finances, dreaded these discussions. The monarchy's treasury was not flush with gold, and the Iron Bank had a reputation for ruthless efficiency in collecting what it was owed. Jon and Daenerys recognized they could not simply refuse to pay, as that would damage any chance of rebuilding trade. So they arranged a meeting in the Red Keep Solar. 2 representatives from the Iron Bank arrived, impeccably dressed, their demeanor calm yet relentless. They pointed out that the monarchy had changed hands repeatedly, but the debt remained. Tyrion negotiated on behalf of the crown with Daenerys at his side. They proposed a long-term repayment structure with partial forgiveness in exchange for new shipping routes and preferential trade agreements in Westeros's major ports. The bankers listened, stone-faced. They did not refuse outright, but they drove a hard bargain. Jon watched as Tyrion sparred verbally with them, each side pressing for advantage. In the end, they reached a provisional agreement that avoided immediate financial collapse. The crown would have to make good on its promises over time, but the Iron Bank would withhold draconian measures so long as payments flowed. As autumn approached, fresh concerns surfaced in the northwestern reaches of the realm. Reports trickled in that bands of brigands were harassing villages along the Gold Road. Some wore old sigils from fallen houses, while others claimed no banner. Their motives varied, some seemed desperate survivors of war, others opportunists seizing on lawlessness. Jon felt a surge of responsibility. The crown had to protect its subjects. Yet the royal army was stretched thin, the unsullied Dothraki not ideally suited to extended policing missions in distant provinces. Daenerys suggested sending a contingent of the City Watch, augmented by the knights who had pledged allegiance from the Riverlands and the Crownlands. Jon countered that they should also dispatch a reliable commander, someone with a balance of martial skill and fairness. Ser Brienne volunteered to lead such a force, citing her oath to protect the realm. She had grown into one of Daenerys's and Jon's most trusted knights, having already proven her loyalty and sense of justice. After some deliberation, they agreed to entrust her with the mission. With a small but well-organized host, Ser Brienne departed King's Landing, intending to restore order and, if possible, extend mercy to the desperate folk who might be robbing simply to survive. In this time of fragile reconstruction, letters reached the Red Keep from far-off places. The free folk beyond the wall, under Tormund Giant Spain's informal leadership, sent word that they were rebuilding their own communities now that the White Walkers were no more. They asked only that the crown respect their autonomy. They had no desire for further conquest or assimilation. Jon, remembering how he had fought to protect them during the wars, penned a personal reply. He told Tormund that as long as they did not raid south of the wall, they were free to live their way of life. He also invited the free folk to trade if they wished, offering limited resources from the north. The arrangement was unconventional. Few southern kings had ever offered such courtesy to wildlings, but Jon understood them as more than that old slur. Daenerys supported his choice, seeing it as another way to prevent future conflict. She also recognized that every living soul in the north, free or otherwise, had contributed to the victory over the dead. The year pressed on. The nights grew gradually longer, the wind sharper. One golden afternoon, as the leaves on the few nearby trees began to redden, Daenerys felt a wave of nausea while attending a meeting with Tyrion and Davos. She excused herself abruptly, pressing a hand to her stomach. Worried, Jon followed her out. She waved away the maester's attempts to fuss over her at first, insisting it was nothing. But the queasiness returned over the next few days, accompanied by dizziness in the mornings. At length, she allowed the maester to conduct a proper examination. When he gently informed her that she was with child, her eyes filled with a complex mix of fear, wonder, and hope. She and Jon spoke privately that evening. Daenerys recalled the old story she had shared in Essos about her difficulty conceiving, the trauma she had endured in the aftermath of Khal Drogo's death, and the dark magic that had taken her child. She had convinced herself that motherhood was beyond her reach. Now, faced with this possibility, her heart pounded with both joy and anxiety. Jon was quiet for a long moment. She could see his brow furrow, the memories of all they had lost. Then he gathered her into his arms and held her close, offering a promise to protect her and their child with every breath. The realm was precarious, but perhaps a new life could be a beacon of hope. That night, they lay awake for hours, whispering about the future, about the child who would be heir to 2 ancient houses. There was a sense of awe between them. The next day, they decided to tell only a handful of trusted advisors, Tyrion, Davos, Sansa, for now, wishing to keep the news quiet until they were certain she was healthy. Despite Daenerys' pregnancy, she refused to remain idle. She continued her audiences, though she began to tire more easily. Jon took on additional responsibilities, ensuring she had time to rest. The monarchy adapted, and rumors began circulating about why the queen appeared less frequently in the public squares. Tyrion deflected the queries with jokes about the queen taking time to plan new expansions for the city. Some lords guessed the truth, but none could confirm it. In the hush of their bedchambers, Jon and Daenerys let themselves daydream occasionally about the color of their child's hair, the shape of their eyes, the possibility of them someday riding dragons or carrying a sword in the cold north. It was a tender thread of possibility woven through the weight of ruling. The daily routine persisted. Long councils, tough negotiations, slow progress on the roads. Letters and messages, small ceremonies to restore local officials. Some days, the demands were crushing. Others, they glimpsed small victories, a new aqueduct repaired, a band of brigands captured and offered clemency if they agreed to serve in the city watch. The shift was gradual but undeniable. King's Landing grew more stable. The people learned to differentiate between the old fear of the Targaryen name and the reality of Daenerys' measured governance. They noted the king's northern bluntness, which stood in stark contrast to Cersei's cunning or Robert's excess. The presence of dragons overhead remained a subject of awe, but it became increasingly linked to the idea of protection, not devastation. Drogon and Regal roost frequently on the scorched remains of the dragon pit. Sometimes they soared out to hunt, returning to the city hours or days later. Daenerys checked on them when she could, reassuring them with her presence, letting them sense her bond even as her body began its slow shift into motherhood. An autumn storm lashed the city one evening, bringing heavy rain and thunder. In the flicker of lightning, the Red Keep's towers seemed to tremble. Jon and Daenerys sheltered in a private solar with Tyrion and Davos, going over the latest reports from Brienne's campaign against the brigands. The news was mixed. Some villages had been secured, a few ringleaders had been killed, and others had surrendered. But there was also talk of new outlaws forming in the hilly regions near the Westerlands border. The question arose, should the crown push deeper, risk more men, or consolidate what they had achieved? Jon rubbed at his eyes, fatigued. He recalled the North's endless fights, the times they had overextended themselves and nearly lost everything. Daenerys, too, knew the cost of stretching forces too thin. Ultimately, they decided to send an envoy with moderate reinforcements to the area, but not to commit to a full-scale campaign. They agreed it was better to root out unrest step by step, mindful that overreach could spark bigger conflicts. Even as these decisions occupied their minds, a tense undercurrent lingered. Not everyone was satisfied with a stable, united monarchy. Whispers from across the narrow sea spoke of mercenary companies forming under exiled Westerosi, men who had fled or been banished. Some had ties to the Golden Company, though that famed group had largely been broken during the final battles of Cersei's reign. Others were smaller, scattered pockets of sellswords seeking a new cause or a chance to plunder. Tyrion received a coded letter indicating that certain exiled lords were in league with unscrupulous bankers in lists, hoping to undermine the monarchy and perhaps even fund a coup. These threats, vague as they were, weighed heavily. A realm newly at peace was ripe for infiltration by those who trafficked in chaos. Daenerys insisted on reinforcing coastal defenses around Blackwater Bay, commissioning more war galleys. Jon approved the stationing of loyal men in key ports to watch for unusual maritime traffic. They could not lock the realm down entirely, trade had to flow, and the crown needed coin. But they would stay vigilant. In an effort to foster more goodwill, Daenerys decided it was time to visit the Reach and the Westerlands personally if her health permitted. She believed that presenting a living presence in those regions might quell some doubts. Jon was hesitant, the roads were still not entirely safe, and Daenerys' pregnancy was a concern. But she argued that if the realm never saw their queen outside King's Landing, rumors would only grow. She offered a compromise. They would travel by ship down the coast to the Reach, as sea travel was faster and safer than land routes. Regal and Drogon could follow overhead, and the presence of dragons would deter would-be pirates. Jon finally consented, albeit with conditions that the ships be well guarded and that a seasoned maester travel with them. Within 2 weeks, a small royal fleet prepared to depart from the harbor of King's Landing. The flagship was a sturdy vessel that had once belonged to Stannis Baratheon, refitted for the crown's use. Yara Greyjoy sent one of her fastest longships to accompany them, a sign of renewed alliance. Gendry, wanting to ensure the safety of the route to the Stormlands, also sent 2 smaller ships. The sails bore the joined sigils of Stark and Targaryen. By the time they embarked, Daenerys showed the faintest curve of pregnancy at her waist, though she still moved with grace. The city's populace gathered along the harbor walls to watch the king and queen depart. Some cheered. Many simply looked on, unsure, but less fearful than they once were. As the sails caught the wind and the harbor receded, Daenerys stood on the deck with Jon at her side, inhaling the salty air. A swirl of memory assailed her, crossing the narrow sea with the hopes of conquest, that fierce burning in her heart. She had arrived in Westeros not so long ago, determined to reclaim her birthright. Now she was leaving its capital as a reigning queen, her child growing within her, on a journey not of war but of peace. The transformation felt surreal. Jon, wearing weather-worn leathers rather than any regal cloak, looked out at the rolling waves. He had never been fond of sea travel, but he kept that discomfort in check, focusing on the presence of Daenerys. Even as the gulls cried overhead, the faint shriek of dragons cut through the clouds, reminding all who saw them that this was no ordinary royal expedition. The first stop was at the harbor near the Rose Road that led into the Reach. The local lords greeted them politely, if not effusively. They had arranged a modest welcome in a rebuilt fortress near the coastline. Most of the grand castles were inland. The presence of dragons unnerved them. Drogon and Regal swooped overhead before landing on a cliff, shaking the ground with their weight. Daenerys attempted to put the local lords at ease, explaining that the dragons would not harm their lands so long as no one tried to attack them. Nonetheless, the lords kept a wide berth, ensuring that any livestock was well guarded. Over a brief feast that evening, Daenerys and Jon listened patiently to the local concerns about banditry in the region, the slow pace of harvests, and the dreaded memory of when the Reach had been sacked in the wars. They reassured them that the crown was doing all it could to promote stability. The warmth in Daenerys' smile and the quiet earnestness of Jon's replies did much to soothe frayed nerves. Still, the lords could not help but note the tension in Daenerys' posture when questions arose about her potential heir. They suspected what might be happening, though none dared to ask outright. On the second day, the party traveled inland to inspect farmland and meet with other local notables. Daenerys managed the ride on a gentle mare, while Jon rode a northern stallion. The air was scented with late-season flowers. Fields of grain had begun to turn golden in the autumn sun. The people in the nearby villages were cautious at first, but the sight of the king and queen speaking kindly to them, the presence of dragons perched in the distance, and the stories of how these two had battled the undead gradually disarmed their fear. A few farmhands approached, asking if it was true that the dragons had once been small enough to perch on Daenerys' shoulder. She laughed softly, recalling the distant memory of newborn dragons in the Red Waste. When they saw the genuine warmth on her face, they bent the knee without needing to be asked. The day ended with a small gathering in a meadow where local minstrels played softly and Daenerys sipped water instead of wine, mindful of her condition. Jon quietly stood watch beside her, occasionally asking farmers about their challenges and gleaning knowledge about the land. They continued along the coastal route, stopping at key ports. Wherever they went, they repeated the pattern, meeting lords, hearing petitions, reassuring the small folk, and demonstrating that their monarchy was not aloof or hostile. Some lords found it disconcerting. They were used to distant kings and queens who demanded fealty rather than requested cooperation. Yet even the most skeptical among them had to admit that Daenerys and Jon were consistent in their approach. No signs of cruelty, no sudden demands of tribute, no forced conversions to the faith of the Seven or to the old gods of the North. The monarchy, it seemed, wanted genuine stability. Word of the queen's pregnancy began to spread through rumor and observation. Servants noticed how carefully the maester attended her, how she refused wine. Gossip flared in local courts. Some saw it as a sign of the Targaryen line continuing in earnest, while others worried about how the child might upset the balance of power. Still, no official announcement had been made, and Daenerys was grateful that she could keep some semblance of privacy in that regard. The turning point came when the party arrived at Oldtown. That ancient city, seat of the Citadel and home to the Hightower, had long been a bastion of learning and faith. The lords of Oldtown were famously conservative, steeped in tradition. They had watched the wars, the dragons, and the rumored White Walkers with deep skepticism. Now, they prepared a formal reception for the king and queen. The Hightower loomed over the city's harbor, and as Jon and Daenerys' fleet approached, they could see smaller ships scurrying out of the way, fearful of dragons overhead. A hush fell upon the docks when Drogon and Regal descended, sending gusts of wind and salt spray in all directions. A line of maesters waited, dressed in their chains, along with the ruling lord of Oldtown, Leighton Hightower, who was advanced in years. His family was arrayed behind him, and the faith's local septons stood with quiet formality. For a moment it seemed uncertain whether they would kneel or merely bow. Then Lord Hightower, with some effort, bent his knee. The maesters inclined their heads. The septons offered blessings. Daenerys and Jon accepted these gestures with polite solemnity. Later that evening, they were escorted up the winding steps of the High Tower through corridors lined with dusty tomes and relics of a more ancient age. They met with the Archmasters at the Citadel, who had recently reaffirmed Daenerys's and Jon's right to rule in the public record, an important symbolic gesture. During the meeting, Daenerys could not help but reflect that once she had little need for the Citadel's approval. She had believed in her destiny by Dragonfire. But she was no longer that woman who saw only conquest. She needed the knowledge and support of these scholars if the realm was to rebuild. Jon, too, remembered how Samwell Tarly had tried to glean vital information here about the White Walkers. This place had saved them, in a way, by teaching them about dragonglass and the significance of ancient records. That evening, a formal dinner was held in the Great Hall of Oldtown. Archmasters, septons, and local nobles shared the table with the king and queen. Conversation was subdued. Leighton Hightower, his hands shaking with age, asked Jon about the winter they had faced in the north. Jon described the biting cold, the endless night, and the horror of the undead. Most in the hall seemed both fascinated and disbelieving. Perhaps the White Walkers were too large a concept for them to grasp, a distant legend that had apparently been vanquished. Daenerys spoke of Essos, her campaigns to free slaves, her belief in justice. The maesters listened politely, though a few exchanged glances. Jon noticed that some of them still questioned the notion of a foreign-born queen leading Westeros. Yet none voiced open defiance. Partway through the meal, Daenerys's face paled and she reached for her goblet of water. Alarmed, Jon placed a hand on her arm. She breathed slowly, trying to steady herself. The abrupt hush at the table signaled that all eyes were on her. She offered a tight smile, apologizing for a moment's dizziness. The maester traveling with them stood, ready to assist, but Daenerys refused to make a scene. She insisted she just needed to step away for fresh air. Jon, with a quietly firm hand, escorted her out of the hall. In that moment, many in attendance realized the truth: the queen was with child. A tense ripple went through the crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire. Outside, on a private balcony overlooking the city's lantern-lit canals, Daenerys rested against Jon's shoulder, breath uneven. The child stirred within her, or so she thought. She felt fear coil in her stomach, fear for the pregnancy, for the realm, for all the expectations that would come. Jon stroked her hair, murmuring that it was all right, that the day had been too long, that they could leave if she wished. She shook her head, determined to maintain dignity. After a few minutes, she steadied herself, and they returned to the hall, heads held high. The next morning, Leighton Hightower asked to speak privately with Daenerys and Jon. In his tower chambers, draped in ancient tapestries, he gently broached the subject of the queen's health. He congratulated them on the possibility of an heir, then inquired if they would seek the services of the Citadel's best maesters. Daenerys, warmed by his concern, asked what he advised. He spoke in a slow, careful voice, explaining that pregnancy could be perilous, especially for a woman who had endured war. Oldtown had some of the most experienced midwives and maesters in the realm. Many a noblewoman had traveled here for care. He suggested that if Daenerys stayed for a season, it could ensure the best chance of a safe birth. Jon frowned. Winter would come again soon enough, though perhaps not the same catastrophic winter they had just survived, and the realm needed them. Yet Daenerys could see the sense in Lord Hightower's offer. They debated the matter with Tyrion and Davos that afternoon. If Daenerys remained in Oldtown for a few months, it might reassure the older houses of the Reach that she respected their traditions. It would also free Jon to travel further or return to King's Landing as needed. But it would split the monarchy. The realm was fragile. Some might see it as a sign of weakness if they were separated. Or they might interpret Daenerys' sojourn in Oldtown as a retreat. Ultimately, Daenerys decided that her health and the safety of the unborn child took precedence. Ruling would mean nothing if she jeopardized both. Jon, though reluctant, agreed. They would remain together in Oldtown for a time, continuing to send directives to King's Landing by Raven. Tyrion could manage daily matters in the capital, assisted by Sansa, who had chosen to return north but could be summoned back if needed. It was not ideal, but necessity rarely bowed to convenience. Over the next several weeks, Daenerys settled into a suite of rooms near the top of the High Tower. The Citadel's Archmasters consulted with her maester, prescribing rest and special tonics. Jon established a temporary council in Oldtown, meeting with local lords who traveled in. Messages flew to and from King's Landing, covering everything from troop deployment to trade negotiations with Dorne. Daenerys penned letters daily, her Targaryen determination flaring whenever someone suggested she do less. She refused to be idle, even if her body demanded more frequent sleep. When she was well enough, she ventured into the city's winding streets. She visited the starry September, once the seat of the High Septon in ages past, and spoke with the Septons about the faith's role in healing the populace after so many wars. She rode a barge along the canal, examining the city's stone bridges and graceful architecture. Everywhere she went, she drew curious crowds, but fewer tongues whispered about her past. The knowledge of her pregnancy seemed to humanize her in the eyes of Oldtown's citizens. Jon spent his spare moments by her side, often reading the Citadel's records or discussing future policies with her. At night, they would sit together on a narrow balcony, gazing at the flickering lights of the city below, the distant shape of Drogon and Regal perched on the city's walls. They spoke of the future child, whether they might name them after lost loved ones, whether the child would inherit the legacy of the Dragon Lords or the stoic grit of the Starks. Daenerys still harbored flickers of fear, memories of the tragedies she had faced, the warnings that she would never bear a living child. But Jon's steady presence helped quell those nightmares. Sometimes, in the hush of midnight, he would place a hand on her belly and feel a flutter of movement, each sign of life a quiet miracle. As time passed, ravens brought mixed news from King's Landing. Tyrion reported progress on re-establishing trade alliances and continuing to root out corruption. However, rumors persisted that a faction of discontented lords was stirring, led by a minor noble with old ties to House Lannister. They grumbled that the crown was too soft, that the monarchy was beholden to the north and foreign influences. Tyrion downplayed the severity of their plotting but warned that dissatisfaction could grow if left unchecked. Jon wrestled with whether he should return to King's Landing and confront them directly. Daenerys, her health improving in the calmer environment of Oldtown, considered traveling back with him. But the Archmasters advised her that such a voyage would be risky now. She was entering a stage of pregnancy where any heavy stress might endanger both her and the child. In the end, Jon decided he could not leave her side for too long. He arranged to send Davos instead, accompanied by Grey Worm and a handful of trusted knights, to keep watch over the city and quell any simmering threats. Davos had long been a voice of reason and loyalty. If anyone could manage the tensions in the capital without resorting to cruelty, it was him. Jon wrote letters to Sansa requesting her input and possibly her presence if matters escalated. Autumn deepened, the nights in Oldtown growing cool. Daenerys found herself taking evening walks through the High Tower's gardens, her steps slower now, her belly rounded. She could feel the child's increasingly insistent kicks, and sometimes she would pause beneath a lantern to catch her breath. Jon would linger with her, a gentle hand at her elbow. In those moments, the burdens of ruling seemed distant. They were just a man and a woman awaiting a child's arrival. Yet they could never fully escape who they were. Guards trailed them at a respectful distance, and the occasional flicker of dragon wings in the sky reminded the city that the monarchy's power was never far away. One afternoon, a message arrived from Brienne. She reported that the outlaws near the Gold Road had been largely subdued, with some joining her force and others scattered. The roads were safer. Merchants traveled with fewer worries. Another raven came from Gendry, who expressed gratitude for the reinforcements that had allowed the Stormlands to repel a pirate raid on their coast. All these small triumphs indicated that the realm was stabilizing. Yet Tyrion's letters remained laced with caution. King's Landing still teemed with political intrigue. Many sought to test the monarchy's true strength while the queen was away. Daenerys, frustrated by her forced distance, wrote back that she would return as soon as the child was born and strong enough to travel. Jon penned letters of his own, urging patience from the discontented lords, reminding them that Westeros must remain united to avoid repeating the tragedies of the past. Whether those letters would suffice was uncertain. Days stretched into weeks. Daenerys's belly grew heavier. The Archmasters, who were not used to caring for a pregnant queen, circled her with well-meant advice. Some recommended bed rest, others prescribed mild walks. She accepted bits of each, forging her own path, unwilling to be caged in a tower room but mindful of the baby's needs. Jon spent more time studying the Citadel's archives, gleaning knowledge about the Targaryen dynasty's history, searching for precedents for shared rule. He found few examples that resembled their situation, but he did stumble upon accounts of Rhaegar Targaryen's interest in prophecy and the prince that was promised. Jon had heard enough of that prophecy to know it was best handled with caution. Prophecies had a way of fueling fanaticism. Yet part of him wondered if it had any bearing on the child Daenerys carried. He kept those musings to himself, determined not to burden her with more worries. As winter's edge drew near, Daenerys went into labor. It happened in the pre-dawn hours, beneath a sky faintly touched by starlight. She awoke with a deep ache and a sudden rush of pain that made her gasp. Jon scrambled for the maesters, who hurried in with stoic calm, preparing hot water and cloths. Daenerys tried to steady her breathing, sweat beading her brow. Fear and hope warred in her heart. This was the moment she had once believed impossible. Yet here it was roaring into reality. The labor was difficult, lasting many hours. Outside, the Hightower's corridors bustled with an anxious hush. Guards waited, lords exchanged worried glances, and the city below seemed to hold its breath. Jon remained by Daenerys' side, clasping her hand, murmuring encouragement, though he felt helpless in the face of her pain. The maesters did their work, and at last, near midday, the cries of a newborn filled the chamber. It was a girl, small but vigorous, with a tuft of dark hair and a piercing wail that cut through Jon's heart like an arrow of pure relief. Daenerys, exhausted, collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaking her face. The maesters checked the child's health, then carefully placed her in Daenerys' arms. Jon hovered, scarcely able to breathe, his gaze locked on the tiny bundle. He had never thought he would be a father, never imagined he would see such a day. The baby's eyelids flickered open for a moment, revealing eyes that might eventually turn violet or remain dark. It was too soon to tell. Daenerys trembled, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. A powerful rush of love and protectiveness surged in her chest. The child was alive. She was real. The ghosts of the past did not claim her. When the maesters announced that both mother and daughter seemed in good health, a ripple of relief spread through the tower. Word reached the city, and soon bells rang out from the starry September. People in the streets paused to listen, understanding that a new Targaryen Stark heir had been born. A mixture of curiosity, excitement, and uncertainty spread throughout Oldtown. Jon and Daenerys were too overwhelmed by their own joy to dwell on how the realm might react. In that moment, the realm existed only as the space around the bedchamber, where a mother cradled her newborn and a father gently touched tiny fingers with reverent awe. They named her Riella in honor of Daenerys' mother and the Targaryen lineage, but also to mark a new beginning. Riella Targaryen had died amidst a storm, and now this child was born amidst the calm after war, a bridging of two lines. Jon whispered her name as if it were a prayer. Daenerys could hardly tear her eyes away from Riella's face, so full of life and promise. She marveled that this was the future they had dared to envision, a child who might unite the blood of the dragon and the wolf in a gentler era. For 2 days, Daenerys rested. The archmaesters hovered to ensure there were no lingering complications. Jon remained close, learning to hold the baby properly, letting her tiny hand curl around his finger. Riella cried lustily, then fell asleep curled against her mother's breast. This new family, small and precious, forged another link in the chain of Westeros' history. And though the crown still weighed heavily on Jon and Daenerys, for a brief span of time, they allowed themselves to simply be parents, lost in the wonder of it. But a monarchy cannot pause indefinitely. On the 3rd day, Tyrion's raven arrived with urgent tidings. Conflict had broken out in King's Landing. A cluster of minor lords, resentful and emboldened by the Queen's absence, had tried to foment a riot among the city's discontented populace. Davos and Grey Worm had contained the situation, but tension was high. Rumors of the newborn princess had spread, and the conspirators were twisting them to claim the monarchy was too distracted with Targaryen dynastic concerns to care about the city's grievances. Tyrion urged Jon and Daenerys to return as soon as Daenerys was well enough to travel. If they did not, the unrest could spiral, giving enemies a chance to undermine everything they had built. The realm's fear of dragons and foreign rule had not vanished overnight, and with the queen away, opportunists had seized on old prejudices. Daenerys read the message by the light of a shuttered window, exhaustion lining her face, Riella dozing in a cradle beside the bed. Jon stood across from her, fists clenched in frustration. He knew the realm would not give them the luxury of a peaceful aftermath. Still, it felt cruel to uproot Daenerys and their infant daughter so soon. The Archmasters advised waiting at least a few more weeks. But Tyrion's note was unambiguous. The monarchy's hold was slipping. Jon considered going alone, leaving Daenerys and the baby in Oldtown for safety. Yet Daenerys refused. She argued that the realm needed to see them united. If only Jon appeared in King's Landing, malicious tongues might spin stories that Daenerys was unfit or no longer truly queen. That too could spark chaos. So they arranged for a cautious return. The Archmasters cleared Daenerys for travel by ship, provided it was done gently and with ample rest. Riella would accompany them, of course, and a retinue of skilled maesters and wet nurses would come along to ensure the baby's welfare. The small royal fleet would sail north at a careful pace, hugging the coast. Drogon and Regal would follow overhead, ever watchful. Lord Hightower sent them off with his blessing, promising to pray for the princess's continued health. The voyage began on a crisp morning with gulls screeching above and Daenerys wrapped in cloaks to keep Riella warm. Jon, tense with worry, stood by the rail. He could sense the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders once more, heavier than ever. Not only did he have to think of the realm, but of his family, so vulnerable in this unpredictable land. As the ships gained distance from Oldtown, Daenerys looked back at the great Hightower diminishing behind them. It had offered her a haven in which to bring new life into the world. But that life was already pulling her back into the complexities of ruling. She pressed a soft kiss to Riella's forehead. The baby stirred, squirming in her swaddling. Jon touched Daenerys' shoulder. He did not need words, the set of his jaw said enough. They would face whatever was coming together. The sea breeze ruffled their hair, carrying them onward toward King's Landing. Overhead, Drogon let out a distant roar that seemed to echo the unspoken oath in both their hearts. They would do everything in their power to safeguard their child, their realm, and the fragile peace they had fought so hard to create. The journey took nearly 2 weeks, slowed by Daenerys' need for frequent stops in sheltered coves. Each time they anchored, the crew would rush to ready a comfortable tent for the queen and princess. Jon would stride along the beach or the small village docks, speaking to local fisherfolk. News of the princess's birth preceded them, curious eyes followed them wherever they went. Daenerys' face still showed traces of fatigue, but her resolve never wavered. She received small gifts from villagers, flowers, a knitted blanket for Riella, even a carved wooden dragon from a shy boy who trembled with excitement at meeting the queen. Jon made sure the villagers were thanked and that any concerns they had were noted, from harbor taxes to pirate raids. It was a strange mixture of domestic and regal tasks, but each day reminded them that the monarchy was more than a symbol. It was a responsibility that touched every cove and crossing in the land. At last, the walls of King's Landing rose into view. The city looked different in the mild autumn light, somehow smaller after the expanses of the Reach, yet still bustling with life. Tyrion and Davos awaited them at the docks, flanked by Grey Worm and a double line of Unsullied. Onlookers crowded the wharves, craning to see the royal party disembark. Daenerys descended the gangplank slowly, Riella in her arms, Jon beside her. Tyrion stepped forward with a half-bow, eyes flicking to the baby with a rare softness. He murmured a formal greeting, welcoming them back, then glanced around at the crowd. The tension in the air was palpable. Some in the throng bowed deeply, others merely watched with guarded expressions. A cry of "Long live the Queen!" arose sporadically, but it was not universal. Daenerys held Riella close, conscious of the hush that followed. The presence of an infant in her arms seemed to shock those who still thought of her solely as the intimidating Dragon Queen. Under heightened guard, they made their way through the city's main streets to the Red Keep. As they passed, Daenerys noticed signs of unrest, streets that looked less cared for, a few scowling faces in the crowd. She spied walls scrawled with graffiti, slogans like, "No more dragons," or, "The wolf is a bastard king." Yet she also glimpsed people kneeling in respect, hands over hearts, older women whispering blessings for the baby. The city seemed divided. Tyrion explained in a low voice that the conspirators had spread rumors about the monarchy's tyranny and foreignness, while the monarchy's supporters tried to highlight the peace and reconstruction efforts. Clashes had erupted in some neighborhoods, though they had been contained. Davos added that the City Watch had done its best, but discontent thrived in the cramped alleys where folks struggled with hunger or joblessness. At the Red Keep, Daenerys and Jon convened an emergency council in the throne room. The princess was taken to a quieter chamber with her wet nurses, while the queen, still pale from recent childbirth, insisted on standing beside Jon. Lords and ladies of the crownlands filed in, along with representatives of guilds and the faith. Tyrion began by outlining the trouble. A faction of lesser lords, many of whom had lost position or coin under the new regime, was agitating for power. They had latched onto any complaint in the city: rising food prices, new taxes for reconstruction, the presence of Dothraki in the region. Much of the rabble-rousing was fueled by the notion that the monarchy cared only about a new Targaryen dynasty, forgetting the small folk. Tyrion's spies indicated a plan to provoke open riots that might force the monarchy to crack down violently, thus turning more people against them. Davos nodded, explaining that he and Grey Worm had managed to suppress the initial outbreaks, but the tension was still there. Jon and Daenerys exchanged a look. They had dreamed of peace, but they always knew ruling was not a storybook ending. It was an unending struggle to maintain balance. Daenerys took a breath, her tone cool yet resolute. They would not meet violence with indiscriminate dragonfire. She reminded the council that they had learned the lesson of what fear alone would bring. Jon concurred, adding that if they let the conspirators push them into harsh reprisals, the realm would slip back into tyranny. Instead, they needed to address the root causes of the discontent. Some in the council murmured agreement while others expressed doubt. One noble insisted that force was the only language rabble understood. Daenerys fixed him with a stare that silenced him. She had once believed in the power of fire and blood, but she had walked a long road since then. She would not let her child inherit a realm consumed by fear. They announced a series of measures to quell the unrest. Public forums would be held where citizens could air grievances safely, with the city watch ensuring order. Grain prices would be subsidized through the crown's stores, at least temporarily, to relieve hunger. And a new code of conduct for the Dothraki patrols would be enforced so that the city's inhabitants felt less threatened. In return, the monarchy demanded that no violence be done against their foreign allies. They also established a small committee led by Davos and joined by local guild leaders to inspect neighborhoods with the worst conditions, see how to improve them, and identify troublemakers who sought to exploit genuine complaints for personal gain. It was a delicate strategy, open enough to grant people a voice but firm enough to deter conspirators. Tyrion seemed cautiously optimistic. But real peace would require more than decrees. It would require the monarchy's active presence in the city. So Jon and Daenerys walked the streets again, this time with baby Riella occasionally appearing, though mostly kept safe within the Red Keep. They visited impoverished districts, speaking directly to the small folk. Daenerys repeated her willingness to listen, explaining calmly that she had once been a stranger in a foreign land, too. Jon talked of the hardships in the north and how they had survived only by uniting. Some cynics scoffed, but others softened when they heard sincerity in the royals' voices. The conspirators, robbed of an easy target, found it harder to stoke the flames of rebellion. A few minor lords were unmasked and charged with inciting violence. Rather than execute them publicly, Daenerys and Jon had them tried by a panel of local magistrates. Some were sentenced to exile, others to forced labor in rebuilding efforts. The monarchy's measured approach earned reluctant respect from many onlookers. In the weeks that followed, the city calmed. The baby princess became a symbolic figure, proof of a new future. People whispered that the child of ice and fire might bring about a time without the cruelty of old. It was an idealized notion, of course. Conspiracies and grudges still lurked in the shadows. But at least for now, the realm drew back from the brink of chaos. Daenerys, fully recovered from childbirth, began to resume her duties with renewed vigor. She saw the weariness in Jon's eyes, the weight of endless tasks, and she gently reminded him that they shared this burden. He nodded, grateful for her unwavering partnership. Together, they led councils, heard petitions, and shaped the next steps in reconstruction. Slowly, the city's battered heart began to beat with a steadier rhythm. One evening, as a mild winter approached, they stood atop the Red Keep's battlements, gazing out at the flickering lights of the capital. Riella slept in a cradle nearby, watched by a trusted nurse. Drogon and Regal soared in lazy circles above, their silhouettes crossing the moon. Daenerys leaned against Jon, her cloak drawn tight, a small smile on her lips. She told him how she used to dream of the city when she was a child, floating from one corner of Essos to another, never having a home. She had imagined taking the Iron Throne in a blaze of glory. Now, she said, she understood that ruling was not about seizing a chair of melted swords. It was about tending to a realm's people day after day, forging bonds of trust rather than shackles of fear. Jon listened, recalling his own journey, growing up as a Snow, always feeling lesser, then learning of his Targaryen heritage. He had once thought his destiny lay at the wall, protecting the realm from the horrors beyond. He never pictured himself as a king, let alone a husband and father. The swirl of fate had brought them here, bound by love as much as by blood. He kissed Daenerys' temple, warmth blossoming in his chest. Perhaps the realm would always be riddled with challenges, conspiracies, and heartbreak. But if they ruled with open hearts, if they chose compassion over cruelty, maybe they could steer Westeros away from yet another cycle of devastation. Below, in the winding streets, a new hush took hold. Not the hush of fear, but the hush that descends when night blankets a city ready for dawn. A fisherman in the harbor counted his coins from a fair day's catch. A blacksmith hammered out a final horseshoe by lamplight, remembering how work had dwindled before. A seamstress huddled with her family in a modest home, comforted by the knowledge that the riots had died down. On a rooftop, a child gazed at the huge shapes of the dragons gliding overhead, imagining stories of knights and queens that didn't always end in slaughter. And in the Red Keep, Jon and Daenerys stood watch, shoulders touching, eyes fixed on the realm they had inherited and reforged. Their child slept a few paces away, a symbol of the future they hoped to secure. In the corridors below, loyal guards patrolled and Tyrion scribbled away at some plan for the treasury. Davos, half asleep over a ledger, dreamed of a realm at peace. Brienne was off on another mission, ensuring travelers could journey without fear. Sansa was in the north, overseeing winter preparations, but her letters were kinder now, more trusting of Daenerys' intentions. Arya roamed the land, perhaps, or the seas. No one was certain, but Jon prayed she was safe. Bran watched from afar, bound to the old gods and the ravens. The realm was not perfect, but it was healing. Night's wind brushed Daenerys' hair. She took Jon's hand and he squeezed gently. Their breath mingled in the chill air, carrying silent vows for all that lay ahead. Wars had carved deep scars into Westeros, but perhaps, in this era ushered in by their union, those scars could be tended. Not eradicated, no single reign could undo centuries of bloodshed, but softened into lessons that guided them. The gentle coo of Riella's sleeping breath reminded them of what was at stake. They would defend their child from the mistakes of the past, forging a gentler path, determined to rule not as tyrants or conquerors, but as guardians of life and hope. High above, the dragons roared in the moonlight, their cries neither menacing nor submissive, simply a testament to a new age, one that melded ice and fire into something as close to harmony as the realm had ever known. And so the days and nights continued, weaving a tapestry of challenges and triumphs. Each morning, Jon and Daenerys woke to new tasks, new dilemmas, new joys watching Riella grow. Each sunset, they returned to each other, exchanging weary smiles and silent reassurances that they walked this path side by side. The city adapted, the lords grudgingly aligned themselves with stability, and the small folk saw that the monarchy did not wield dragonfire to scorch them into submission. Trust grew bit by bit. No one could say what the far future held. Perhaps there would be new threats from distant shores or power-hungry lords who tried to seize advantage. But for now, the country that had once bled from 1,000 open wounds found a measure of respite. Under the combined banners of the wolf and the dragon, a child's cry echoed in the Red Keep, a sign that tomorrow might indeed be different from yesterday's storms. The seeds of peace had taken root in battered soil, nurtured by a king and queen who had learned the high cost of war. And in the quiet eyes of their people, one could discern a cautious but genuine hope, the notion that maybe, just maybe, this marriage born of ice and fire would guide Westeros into a new dawn at last.